All right, welcome back. So I get asked the question all the time, is there another way to factor? And the answer to that is yes. I personally find the way that I've been teaching you, where you split up the first and last terms, I find that to be the fastest way for me personally. But today I'm going to show you another method that involves grouping. Before we do that though, I want to make sure that you really understand the first way, and specifically I want to make sure that you understand when the signs are the same or when the signs are different of your factors. So I have some nonsense problems here. You can't actually do anything with these, but I just want you to look at them and decide, well, what are the signs going to be? Are the signs going to be the same or different? And if they're the same, is it going to be both minus signs or both plus signs? So quick reminder, you're looking at the last term, right? Remember, we always split up the first and last term. The first term I always want you to split into a positive, but the last term, if the last term is negative, remember we're multiplying to get the last term. So if it's negative, the signs have to be different. So I need to put a plus sign and a minus sign. And it doesn't matter if you write it as a minus and then a plus in this case, because we don't actually know what pancake squared is or what syrup is or what maple is, right? So one more together. So number 2, look at the last term. The last term is positive, right? So because it's positive, I know I have to multiply 2 positives or 2 negatives together. Remember, you're always adding to get the middle term, right? Combining like terms to get the middle term. So because the middle term is negative, this one is going to be minus, minus. So now, I want you to stop the video and try 3 through 9 100% on your own, and then just chime in again to make sure that you have the correct answers. And here are the correct answers. Real quick, I just want to remind you, when the signs are different, because we don't know what Dutch, apple, and pie are, it doesn't matter if it goes plus minus or minus plus. So I switched it up a little bit, right? So as long as your signs are different there, it doesn't matter which one goes where. So let's move on. I have 5 problems here that I just want you to stop the video and factor. And I also want you to check your inners and your outers as you're going through and doing it. So completely stop the video. Take about 5 or 10 minutes right now to just do these 5 problems on your own and then tune back in. So here are the answers to those 5 problems. Now, if I were to ask you, which of these problems were easier and why? My guess is you would probably say that 10, 11, and 12 are easier, right? Part of the reason for that is because the very first term is an x squared, and there's only one way to do an x squared, right? And then also when you check your inners and outers, basically your inners and outers, when you multiply them together, you get 40. When you add them, you get the middle term. And that's true here, right? -8 times -5 is 40, and -8 plus -5 is -13. So really, with these problems, these first 3, you're really just looking for 2 things that multiply to give you the last term, but add to give you the middle term, right? So we're multiplying to get the last term, we're adding to get the middle term, right? Isn't that true? -25 times 4 is -100, and -25 plus 4 is -21. Here, we know we have to get 11 in the middle, so really we're just multiplying 2 things. We're finding 2 numbers that multiply to give me -12, but add to give me 11. Those problems are much easier. These problems down here, 13 and 14, however, took a little bit more time, right? Because that rule of multiplying to get 12 and adding to get 17, -17, doesn't work. And the reason it doesn't work is because of this 6x squared here, because you have to break that up as well. So however you break up that first term is going to change your middle terms, right? And you have more factors to try, okay? So because 13 and 14 sometimes can get kind of frustrating, I'm going to show you another way to do it, right? If we can figure out what the 2 middle terms are going to have to be, we can use factoring by grouping to do it, right? So if I was able to look at this problem and be like, okay, so the 2 things that I need to multiply together, or the 2 things I need to add together to get the middle term is -8x and -9x, then I could just put those in the middle of this polynomial, right? So let me just show you for just a moment. If I could figure out those 2 middle terms, what we would do is we would say, okay, the polynomial that I have is 6x squared, right? And I know my two middle terms have to be negative 8x and negative 9x. And I know my last term has to be 12, right? So now, if you look, if you can get all four terms, well then, look, you can just factor by grouping, right? I can put these together. The GCF of this is negative, or 2x. When you pull out the 2x, you're left with 3x minus 4. And then here, reminder, when we're finding the GCF of this, the negative is included, right? Because it's like we're adding a negative. I pull out the GCF there. Because it's negative, I got to pull out a negative 3. Divide everything by negative 3, and you are left with 3x minus 4. And now look, the 3x minus 4 is the thing that they have in common, so that's the GCF of that. And then what's left is the 2x minus 3, which is what we have up here. So it does depend, though. We have to be able to get our two middle terms. So let's talk about those two middle terms, right? Up here, if I multiply these together, it gives me the last term. If I add them, it gives me the middle term, right? Multiply, get the last term, add, get the middle term, okay? The same is somewhat true here, too. The adding of these has to give me the middle term. If I multiply these two middle terms together, well, let's think about it. Negative 8x times negative 9x, well, that's 72x squared, right? Well, let's think about this. The reason this problem is difficult is because of the 6x squared. Well, let's look. If I multiply these two terms together, 6x squared times 12x squared. Go ahead, grab a calculator, do it. 6 times 12. Oh, that's actually 72x squared. So the rule is basically you can get the middle terms by trying to figure out, okay, what two things multiply to give me what the first term and the last term are, and add to give me the middle term. Okay, so let's look over here for just a second, right? If this were the problem, I would just look and be like, okay, the first term is 10x squared, the last term is negative 12. Well, let's just multiply 10 times negative 12 together, and that gives you negative 120. So if you think about it, if I were trying to do this problem from scratch, I would ask myself, okay, what two things multiply to give me negative 120, but add to give me that middle term? Well, if you look, right here it is. 24 times negative 5 does give me negative 20, and 24 plus negative 5 does give me 19. And then I could figure out my two middle terms. All right, so let's look at this in action, because maybe I'm not making a lot of sense right now. So let's flip to the page. So basically, these polynomials are trinomials in this form, ax squared plus bx plus c. And this is just a general form, right? Saying a is a number, b is a number, and c is a number. So a is always the coefficient of x squared, b is always the coefficient of x, and c is always your constant. That's just what the forms of these trinomials are, right? So the steps are, the very first thing you would do, which we've kind of forgotten about, is we would factor out the GCF if there is one, okay? So we'd pull that out first. Once I've pulled that out, then what I do is I multiply the first term, which I'm calling A, and the last term, which I'm calling B. I multiply those together, and I get a product, right? Well, then I need to find the factors of that product that add to give me the middle term of B. Then what I do is I place these two factors between the ax squared and the c terms, and then I factor by grouping. So let me show you how it works. So the first thing I'm going to do, and I'm not always going to give you this little chart, but this little chart might help us, right? The first thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to multiply my a and c terms together. So that would be the 3 times 5, right? And it's negative 5. So 3 times negative 5. So what I want, the product I want, is negative 15. The sum I want is my bx term, right? My bx term is negative 2, okay? And so what I'm looking for are two things that multiply to give me negative 15, but add to give me negative 2. So let's start thinking about my factors of 15, right? I've got 3 and 5, and keep in mind, I want one to be negative, right? Because the last term is negative, right? Same thing. One of these signs has to be negative. Because my middle term is negative, we want our bigger number to be negative. So if I do 3 times negative 5, if I multiply that, that gives me negative 15. If I add that, that gives me negative 2. Oh, look, I found it. I found it on the first try, which doesn't always happen. If that didn't work, I would try 1 and negative 15. That one doesn't work. Okay, so now what that means is my two middle terms are 3x and negative 5x. So I come back over to the problem, and I'm basically just splitting this up into 3x and negative 5x. So I'm rewriting the problem as 3x squared plus 3x minus 5x minus 5. And honestly, it doesn't matter if you put the 3x first or the negative 5x first. You'll end up with the same answer, just in a different order, okay? So then what I do is I do my factoring by grouping, because now I have 4 terms, right? So we group the first term together, the first 2 terms together, and I pull out the GCF. Well, they both have 3x in common, so I'm going to pull out a 3x, and then what I'm left with is x plus 1, right? Then I put my last 2 terms together, keeping in mind that the first term is negative, so I have to pull out a negative, and the GCF there is negative 5. When I divide these by negative 5, I'm going to get x plus 1. So now look, factor by grouping, x plus 1, both of these terms have in common. So one of your factors is x plus 1. When you divide out the x plus 1, you're left with 3x minus 5. And there you have it. Your factors are x plus 1 and 3x minus 5. And if you wanted to check it, you would go through the FOIL process, right? So in our heads, let's just say x times 3x is 3x squared, right? If I do x times negative 5, well, that gives me negative 5x, which is here, right? Then 1 times 3x, well, that's 3x. And then 1 times negative 5, well, that's negative 5. And then your middle terms would combine to give me negative 2x. All right, let's try another one. It just takes some practice. So first thing we do is we figure out the product of a and b. So really this is multiplying a and b together. So it's doing 7 times 28. This is going to give us a bigger number, which it might now just be like useful to just have a calculator, right? Pull out Desmos or get a graphing calculator from me, but just have a calculator, right? 7 times 28 is 196, right? So I'm going to put 196 here. So what I'm looking for are 2 things that multiply to give me 196, but add to give me the middle number, which is negative 53. Okay? So like when you're coming up with this number's really big, well, let's just start with what you just multiplied together. Is it 7 and 28? So I could say, okay, 7 and 28. First of all, 7 plus 28 gives me positive 35, but keep in mind, I want a negative, right? So that would mean both of these would have to be negative. So we know both our factors have to be negative, right? That one doesn't work, okay? So now let's think of other factors. So when I do this, I'm thinking of, okay, 196, yes, it's even, it's divisible by 2. Another thing is we know 28 went into it, so that means think of your factors of 28 are 4 and 7. So 4 goes into 196. So you could start, like I'm just right now going to divide 196 divided by 4, and I get 49. So I have negative 4 and negative 49, right? They're both negative because we want a negative in the middle. So now 49 and negative 4, oh, there we have it. It's negative 53, right? So there you go. You have your 2 middle numbers, right? You could have also, if you had tried 2, you could have tried negative 2 and negative 98, but that one ended up not working, right? So this is the one. This is the one I want, right? So that means my 2 middle terms are negative 4 and negative 49, all right? So I'm going to start by just rewriting the problem so that I have 4 terms, right? So I have 7x squared minus 4x minus 49x plus 28. Then I'm going to group my first 2 numbers together. Okay, again, it's fine if you put the negative 49x first. Your factors will just end up being in a different order, which is totally fine. So my GCF of 7x squared and negative 4x, well, the only thing they have in common there is an x, right? So I'm going to pull out the x. That's going to leave me with 7x minus 4. Then I look at the next 2 terms. the thing that negative 49x and 28 have in common is negative 7. Reminder, we're pulling out a negative because that term is negative. So you pull out a negative 7, you divide 49x by negative 7, or negative 49x by negative 7, that gives me 7x. And 28 divided by negative 7 is negative 4. Well, there we go. Here is the common factor. That's one of the factors, 7x minus 4. And then what's left is x minus 7. And those are your two factors. Okay? So some people really like this method because it's not really trial and error. It's like you have to find two things that multiply to give me what a times b is and add to give me that middle term. Let's go ahead and try a few more. So when I ask you to factor, I'm not always going to give you a little box that says product and sum. So you're going to have to just kind of think through that on your own. Maybe you're doing it in your head, maybe you're actually writing it down. I'm going to go ahead and write it down, okay? If you feel pretty confident that you understand this, I totally encourage you to stop the video and try these two on your own and then just fast forward the video and see if you got them right, all right? But if you need some more, let's try this one. So I got to figure out my product first. So my product is going to be whatever a times b is. And a times b is 3 times 7, which is 21. I don't know why I'm writing 3 times 7. We're just going to write 21. So we want our product to be 21. So I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me 21, but my sum, I need it to be 22, right? So this is what I want to add. This is what I want to multiply. To me, already, I'm like, oh, that's actually pretty simple, right? Thinking of factors of 21, 7 and 3 don't work, right? Because that gives me 11, but think we're trying to get 22. Oh, it's got to be 1 and 21, right? 1 times 21 is 21, and then when you add that, that does give me 22. So those two work. So these are my middle terms, right? And this problem is also pretty great because everything has to be addition. So we're going to start off with 3x squared. My middle terms are positive x, 1x, and positive 21x plus 7. And then you put your first two terms together, right? These, the GCF is x, okay? And then you get 3x plus 1. And then my GCF of these two is 7. And when you divide both of those terms by 7, you get 3x plus 1. And so the two things I have in common are 3x plus 1. So there's one of my factors, 3x plus 1. And what I have left over is the x plus 7. And there are your factors. Now, if you did do this problem on your own, another way I just want to show you, if you put the numbers in a different order, that's okay. Let's just show you what happens, right? So instead of 3x squared plus x, suppose you have 3x squared plus 21x, and then plus x plus 7, right? Same thing, right? 21x and x are commutative. It doesn't matter what order. And you're still going to get the same answer. It's just going to look slightly different than mine, right? So if I did it this way, the GCF there is 3x, right? And I get x plus 7. And then when I put these together, the GCF here, you do have to write down that the GCF is 1 because we need that other term to be there. So I'm going to pull out the 1, and I'm left with x plus 7 here. So then all that happens here is that the x plus 7 is the common factor, right? And then the 3x plus 1 is what's left. So you still get the same exact factors, it just looks a little bit different. So now I highly encourage you to stop the video and try the next problem and then tune back in. So stop the video, try the next problem, tune back in, see if you can get it. All right, so here's the answer. You should have gotten 3x plus 5 and 2x plus 5. So the middle terms that I found were 10x and 15x. It doesn't matter if you'd put 15x here and 10x here, you still would get these same two factors. The only difference would be that your 2x plus 5 would be here, and you would have a 3x and a 5 here, all right? Another reminder, right, as you're figuring this stuff out, so here I have some examples up here of what I found, right? I added those and those didn't work, and then I finally found it down here. Maybe it didn't take you that long, right? Maybe you're able to do this part in your head. That's totally fine. I want to remind you, however, though, that when you first write this first step, if I were to combine this whole thing, including the middle terms, it should be equal to the problem, all right? Okay, so let's move on now to a couple more problems. These next two are slightly more difficult. Remember on the very first day of factoring, I taught you that the first step to factoring is to pull out a GCF, right? That's true always, right? So if you have a polynomial that you are about to factor, before you even start the problem, you should ask yourself, does the entire thing have a greatest common factor? If it does, you need to write that down, okay? That's one of your factors. You got to pull it out. And pulling out that GCF is going to make the problem so much easier, and it's going to make sure that your answers are correct. So when you're 100% done factoring, none of your factors should contain greatest common factors. If they do, it's not correct. So let's look at number 19 to start with. Let's start first by asking myself, does this have a GCF? And if it does, what is it? So what does it have? What do they all have in common? So if you take a look, we've got 12, 10, and 12. Well, the thing that they all have in common is the factor of 2. The other thing that they all have in common is they all have a y. So I'm going to start this problem off by pulling out a 2y, all right? So I pull out the 2y. When I pull out the 2y, I'm left with 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. Now, the thing I am now trying to factor into binomials is this, 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. So we're kind of ignoring this for a moment, right? I pulled out the 2y. That's a factor. It has to hang out all the way to the very end. We can't get rid of that 2y. It's a factor, all right? However, when I go to factor this into binomials, let's use our new method of factoring by grouping. Multiply 6 times negative 6 together. That's going to give me negative 36. So I want two things that multiply to give me negative 36, but add to give me this middle number. Not this middle number, this middle number. Add to give me 5. All right, so automatically, I know my answers, my terms have to be different signs. So I'm thinking negative 6 and 6. Well, that's not going to work because that's going to give me 0. So let's think of other factors of 6. So let's see, 3 goes into it. So we would say negative 3 and 12. Well, negative 3 and 12, when added, does not give me 5, so that doesn't work. So let's think of some other factors. What about 4, right? Negative 9 and 4. So I could do, or actually negative 4 and positive 9. We want the negative sign to be on the smaller number because we're trying to get a positive 5, right? So there we go. We have it. That one works. So that means my middle terms are negative 4x and 9x. This 2y, I'm just going to keep it there, right? And then I'm going to now take this, and I'm rewriting that as 6x squared minus 4x plus 9x minus 6. And then again, this 2y hangs out. I'm about to group this stuff with parentheses, so I'm going to change this to brackets for just a moment. And so I'm going to pull out now the GCF of the 6x squared minus 4x, which is 2x. I'm going to be left with 3x minus 2. And then I'm going to pull out the GCF of 9x minus 6, which is going to be 3. Divide both of those by 3. I'm going to get 3x minus 2. Close my brackets. So now the GCF of this is 3x minus 2. So now that's going to be one of my factors, 3x minus 2. And then what's left is 2x plus 3. Now those are the factors of just the 6x squared plus 5x minus 6. Don't forget that GCF. That GCF is part of your answer. So this polynomial ends up having 3 factors, right? So you got to pull out the GCF, and it just hangs out there until the very end. So I just keep bringing it down so I don't forget about it. All right? If you feel like you got it, give the next one a try. Okay? I will give you a hint. In number 20, your GCF is negative. So feel free to stop the video and give it a try. I'm going to go ahead and explain it. So remember, when I taught you GCFs, if the leading coefficient is negative, I have to pull out a negative number. All right, so because that's negative, I'm going to pull out a negative number. So I'm thinking of my factors of 16, 60, and 100. I'm immediately thinking of 2, but then I'm remembering, oh wait, if I divide these each by 2, they're still even, so it's probably 4, right? So I'm going to pull out a -4. So -4 is my GCF. I'm going to pull that out to start with and divide everything by -4. All right, so then I'm going to get 4x squared plus 15x minus 25. All right, so now this -4 hangs out to the front, and I'm going to now take 4x squared, and I need to try to figure out what my middle terms are going to be, right? So I'm running out of room, so I'm going to do it down here in the corner. I want two things that multiply to give me -100, right? Because I'm looking for the product of 4 and -25. And then I want two things that add to give me 15. So I'm going to play around with some numbers. I'm going to start with 4 and 25, right? So 4 and 25, think for a second my signs have to be different to get -25. Because I want a positive in the middle, the smaller number has to be negative. But -4 and 25 give me 21, so that's not going to work, right? So let's think of some other factors. What about 20 and 5, right? So what about if I have 20 and 5, the signs have to be different. I want it to be -5. Another reminder, when you are multiplying a positive and a negative together, it gives you a negative. When you add them, it's like you're subtracting, right? 20 and -5 is the same as 20 minus 5. Well, that gives me 15, so that one works. So my middle terms are 20x and -5x. Again, it doesn't matter if you put the 20x first or the -5 first. So I'm going to put 20x minus 5x minus 25. Okay? Reminder, you've pulled out this GCF, so it hangs out to the front. And the thing that we're factoring is the middle, this thing in the parentheses, right? So that's the thing we're looking for. So now I'm going to factor by grouping. I'm going to change this to a bracket. If you don't change it to a bracket and you just have lots of parentheses, that's fine. I'm going to group those together. So that's going to give me 4x. When I pull out the 4x, I'm going to get x plus 5. Then I'm going to group these together. Reminder, since there's a minus sign right there, you're pulling out a negative and dividing both of those terms by -5, which is going to leave me with x plus 5. So again, hopefully you're starting to catch on. If your two sets of parentheses don't come up with the same number, you're probably doing something wrong, okay? That does later mean that the polynomial is probably not factorable, but we'll talk about that later. So now I have -4 is one of my GCF, and my answer is going to be x plus 5, and then 4x minus 5. All right? Now I want you to stop the video, and you need to try both 21 and 22 on your own. We can go over those in class next time I see you, or you can just time in and see if you got the right answers. Okay, so you're doing those two on your own, no questions asked. No, really, did you stop the video? If you didn't, stop the video. If you did, here are the answers. All right, and so here are your answers for 21 and 22. Quick reminder, when you pull out GCFs, I know it can get confusing with like pulling out a 1 and when to pull out a 1. Like, so looking at this problem right here, you may have been like, well, the GCF is 1. We don't care about the GCF being 1 when you're just factoring this trinomial. The only time you want to pull out a 1 is when you're grouping, right? The reason is because I need to have that other factor, right? You need to have, like, you have to have the 1 here in order to get this other factor, okay? So you should always, when you're grouping, have a number in front of your parentheses, always, and then the other, then these two sets of parentheses will be the same, all right? So you are finished. This is how you can factor trinomials by grouping. All right, if you are curious about one more way to do this, there are actually 2 more I can think of, but if you're curious about one more way to do this, stay tuned, okay? So if you're done and this is enough for you, just stop the video, that's fine. But if you're interested in one more, here we go. What I want to do, I'm just going to take the polynomial number 21, the 4x squared minus 17x plus 4, and real quick, I'm just going to check it. Instead of checking it with FOIL, I'm going to check it using the box method. All right, so real fast, I'm just checking this. So thinking about like when we were doing tiles, I would put the x minus 4 on the top and the 4x minus 1 on the side, right? And then I would multiply, right? Whatever goes in this first box is x times 4x, which is 4x squared, right? Whatever goes in this box is the negative 4 times the 4x, which is negative 16x, right? Whatever goes here is going to be the x times negative 1, which is negative x. And then whatever goes in this last box is going to be negative 4 times negative 1, which is positive 4, right? So basically I have a 4x squared. Oh, that's what I had here. I had negative 16x and negative x together. This gives me negative 17x, which is what I want. And that's what I had here, right? And then here is my 4, right? So if I'm looking at a box, the first term has to equal that, right? Which is that. The term in this corner right here has to equal the last term, right? And then these two are your x terms split up, right? So if I'm taking this polynomial, 4x squared minus 17x plus 4, I'm placing my 4x squared here, I'm placing my 4 here. I'm finding my negative x and my negative 16 the same exact way that I do over here. You multiply these two boxes together to get the 16. You add, and then you're adding to get negative 17. These two boxes have to add to give you your middle term, right? So now if you can place the numbers, basically the numbers that we have here in the boxes, then you can get your answer by just pulling out your GCFs of your rows and your columns, right? So look, if I pull out the GCF of 4x squared and negative x, that's x. If I pull out the GCF of negative 16x and 4, that's negative 4. If I pull out the GCF of 4x squared and negative 6x, that's 4x. If I pull out the GCF of 4 and negative x, that's negative 1. And then you have your factors without grouping. So it's the same method, except when you're instead of putting the stuff in a straight line and factoring by grouping, you're just putting the problem in a box, right? So let's just look at the next problem for just a minute, right? So we would always start the problem by pulling out your GCF. So I would just be like, okay, I know that I have a GCF of negative 2, not negative 5. I have a GCF of negative 2 to start with. And what I have left is the 5x squared minus 18x plus 9. So what I would do is I would draw a box, right? I would draw a box, and I would be like, okay, whatever goes in this first corner, it has to equal 5x squared, right? And then I'm looking for positive 9. And then you follow the same thing we did up here. You're looking for two things that multiply to give you 5 and 9, or you can even look at it like two things that multiply to give you this, but add to give you the middle number, right? And we already found that it was negative 3x and negative 15x. So the two middle terms would go in these other two corners. So it would be negative 3x and negative 15x. And then what you do is you get your answer by pulling out the GCFs of your columns and rows, right? So the GCF, oops, I don't know why I'm erasing it. There we go. So the GCF of this column right here would be 5x. So I'd put a 5x up here. The GCF of this column, because the first term is negative, would be negative 3. So there's one of your factors, 5x minus 3. And then you get the GCF of this row, which is going to be just x. And then the GCF of this row is going to be negative 3. So then your other factor is x minus 3. So then you just have to remember that you pulled out the 2, and then this 5x minus 3 is this factor, and this x minus 3 is this factor. So it's just another way of looking at it, right? At this point, I think it's a good idea to practice one of these methods, but if you are perfectly happy with the first method that I showed you, that's fine. I'm not going to require you to know all the methods.